Welcome to Power Players by Origis, critical thinking to deliver the promise of clean energy.
Welcome to a new episode of Power Players by Origis, critical thinking to deliver the clean energy promise. My name is Glenna Wiseman. I'm the head of marketing and communications at Origis Energy. In this episode, we welcome the insights of Joseph Rand, an energy policy researcher at the Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory. Welcome, Joe.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
Well, we are delighted that you're here with us today on a very, what one could call hot topic. So let's just do a brief topic introduction. Demand for clean energy in the U.S. is at unprecedented levels, and so is the community pushback to where these projects are sited. This episode of Power Players is devoted to unpacking the industry's first ever dive into the practices and perspectives of project developers. The groundbreaking Lawrence Berkeley Lab report documents responses from 62 companies. Called Halfway Up the Ladder, the report outlines developer concerns about opposition, typical strategy pivot points that they have made in response to that opposition, and potential paths forward to greater community collaboration. Joe, why did Berkeley Lab tackle this particular research topic?
Yeah, that's a great place to start. So our team at Berkeley Lab has been really exploring, I guess, what you'd call the intersection of renewable energy development and the public for a number of years. I think, you and I both know, and probably most listeners of the podcast are well aware that, renewable energy projects can provide a ton of benefits to local communities that host them. But as well, there are concerns about the impacts of those projects that might be, perceived more negatively. And maybe some of those concerns are legitimate and need to be understood. So we've been doing a whole lot of research from kind of, very rigorous economic analysis of some of the economic impacts in these communities to, more of the social science research relying on surveys and interviews to understand community members' sentiments and perceptions about the development of these projects in their communities and the impacts of those projects. And I would say through that research specifically on community members or maybe neighbors of renewable energy projects that we've conducted through the years, it's become very clear that I guess what you'd call the perceived fairness of the planning process and the development process, it is really vital for fostering community support and realizing, beneficial outcomes for both the developer that's trying to get the project built and also beneficial outcomes for the community that's hosting the project. So that kind of fairness of the planning process, we have the nerds here call it procedural justice, or the justice of the process. And we've just realized more and more over time how important that is. But we hadn't really gotten the voice of developers before. So we've heard a lot from community members through surveys and interviews. Very recently, we've been talking more to local elected officials and permitting officials to ask about the planning process. But again, we really had not seen a study that unpacked developers' perceptions on this and how they go about engaging community members in the process of planning and developing and ultimately constructing and operating renewable energy projects. But another thing I want to point out is that this research also revealed to us, again, prior research, mostly through the lens of host community members, that there was sort of I guess what you'd call kind of a traditional or typical development process that many developers would go through when trying to get a new project built and sited in a community. And I'm not, explicitly talking about renewable energy projects here, but in general, a lot of different development activities would kind of follow this process that prior scholars had coined decide, announce, defend, or DAD. And under that decide, announce, defend model, you basically have the developer coming in with most of the kind of big decisions already made up before they ever approach the community. And they simply sort of announce that to the public and then defend that decision that they've already made against potential public criticism. So I think you can see how that term decide, announce, defend came about. And I think as we learned more from these community members, it became clear that, that could certainly be a source of tension. And again, it was clear that, these perceptions of how the planning process was unfolding, if there was that tension or the sense that it was unfair, that could foster resentment, which could lead to opposition. And ultimately, that opposition could be leading to delays and cancellation of a lot of these projects. So it's a long background on why we wanted to study this topic, but really, to us, we're certainly motivated to kind of understand and address barriers to clean energy development and deployment. And I think we began increasingly through this research from community members to understand, it seems like maybe we could build projects at lower cost and potentially more quickly if we more proactively address the concerns and met the needs of host communities. So we basically felt it was critical to analyze this question from the developer's point of view, not just from community members, and to really try to untangle some of those complexities. And that was a real gap in terms of our understanding. So that's why we conducted the research. It was obviously a big effort and significant expense to collect all these data and analyze it, but we think it's, again, unprecedented insights into how developers operate and think about community engagement.
Okay, so the whole developer perspective was sort of the missing piece in the holistic system that you all have been working on to understand what community opposition and best practice. So why call it halfway up the ladder? What does that mean, and what's the reference there?
Yes, great question. So the halfway up the ladder is actually a reference to a very old, I would say, a foundational or landmark research study that is widely utilized in social science literature that was written by an author named, I think it's Cheryl Arnstein. I'm not sure about the first name, but Arnstein is the last name. And so we call it Arnstein's Ladder. It was originally published in 1969. And it is just simply one of the most established and sort of widely used frameworks for assessing and understanding community engagement in the planning and community development literature or research space. So again, this is just a very foundational theoretical framework on how citizens can or maybe should participate in decision making in terms of development happening in or around their communities. And so we sort of started with that framework when we were thinking about, well, how does this apply in the context of planning and developing renewable energy projects? And I will say that, I think to some degree, Arnstein's theory here is, maybe somewhat utopian. Oh, we should all get to the top of the ladder and that will enhance democracy and that's critical for social justice. But at the same time, as we started doing this research, we realized that, look, there are a lot of compromises as you take each step up the ladder, right? You might be enhancing, direct democracy, but at the same time, you're losing some efficiency and you're spending more to get up the ladder. You're spending more to engage the public. And you're taking more time to engage more of the public. So the more individuals you engage and have involved in decision making, it's just harder and harder to reach consensus. So I think we recognize first, and foremost that the framework is useful as sort of a tool to think about, what's this idealized version in this social justice and social science literature. But also putting that in a realistic context of, look, we are in an industry and in a market with tight profit margins and, just the realities of the way that our market works. It might not be realistic to get to the top of the ladder, but still the ladder itself is sort of a framework to understand where we are. So when we started with that framework, I guess, how did we come to halfway up the ladder? Quite simply, when we asked wind and solar project developers what they thought was the most appropriate way to engage the public in the planning and development of renewable energy projects, where the vast majority of our survey respondents landed was really right there in the middle, halfway up. And again, I want to be clear, we don't really make a judgment on whether that's good or bad. But what we want to do is use this, prior body of research and this framework to help us understand, well, what would it look like if we went up? How could that help us or hurt us? And what are the
Mhm.
trade-offs in terms of cost, time, complication, but what are potentially the benefits in terms of, the benefits that could be realized with potentially enhancing this idea of procedural justice. So again, I think the paper is really framed around trying to unpack and understand those trade-offs, but first and foremost, understanding where we are today in order to have that conversation.
And I think we can get into some of the kinds of, balancing of need to deploy and need to engage as
Yes.
we move forward in the conversation. But we have the unique opportunity right now to talk after you've had this study out a little while in the market, right? So the industry has had a chance to you've been talking at conferences, you've been talking for a few months around, here's what we've learned from these 62 companies operating within the contiguous US.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of information that will be linked in the blog post that we'll do in concert with this conversation. But tell our listeners, what have you learned from developers after the report has come out? What kinds of feedback have you gotten from the market, specifically from developers?
Yeah. Certainly developers were a key audience as we kind of went about conducting this research. So we've really been attuned to engaging with them as we came out with the report here, and then getting their feedback and in some cases responding to that feedback. I should just back up real quick and mention that, in addition to this this paper or journal article that's titled Halfway Up the Ladder, we also have a sort of accompanying slide deck report that's in a kind of PowerPoint deck format that has just a whole lot more charts and graphs, and we were able to do a whole lot more with, I guess, figures and less words in that. So the two kind of go hand in hand nicely, and I just want to make sure that listeners are aware that both exist and they kind of do different things, but they're both part of the same study. And we present them differently and think about them and use them for different audiences too, to some degree. Now, in terms of how developers have responded, like you said, we've shared this work at a lot of conferences now. We've also had just a number of, I guess you'd call them kind of briefings or one-on-one kind of Zoom calls and technical assistance opportunities. In general, I think developers, look, they recognize that community opposition is, I mean, from a developer standpoint, a real thorn in your side, right? And so I think, over the years that our team at Berkeley Lab has been conducting this research, not just on developer experience, but on community members and trying to understand and address opposition and community attitudes broadly, I do think the developer and renewable energy industry has come to see LBNL, my group at Berkeley Lab, as a trusted source of information and to some degree a partner. And so in general, I would say feedback has been positive. Like, there's a lot of insights here that are useful. Some things are challenging. And I think, I will be perfectly blunt that we have had some feedback from developers that simply the framing of the title of this journal article, saying halfway up the ladder, makes it feel like a judgment statement. That's why I wanted to start from the beginning to say, we're using this framework, but we're acknowledging the realities of the market, and we're not necessarily saying we're halfway up and we really need to get to the top or else we're going to be in trouble. But I think it can be and has been interpreted that way. So we have had some kind of concern like, well, that's just not realistic and you don't understand the market that we operate in and things of that nature. We're very open to that feedback, and that's how we learn and do better research going forward. But I would say that, that wasn't necessarily the intent here. Other feedback, I think, to some degree, it's simply just putting numbers to intuitions and numbers to anecdotes that we previously, if this is the right way to say it, things we sort of already knew, but we didn't really know, or we didn't have numbers to support it. As developers, you all are on the front lines dealing with this on a day-to-day basis. but from a scientist standpoint, we might say you have an N of 1. You have a sample size of 1. And what we were able to do is get a sample size of 123 different experiences with the same questions. And when we compile, you have strength in numbers, and you're able to give it a lot more weight. So I think developers, the other bit of feedback that I would say we're receiving is just really recognizing the value in affirming some of our intuitions with rigorous data behind them, and then in other cases kind of challenging some of the things that we thought we understood, we thought we were doing right. And there are some points in the paper and in the report that might challenge some of the assumptions that we would otherwise have. So both of those can be good, and we've certainly received a lot of that feedback.
So can you illuminate us with an example?
Yes, absolutely. So in terms of something that might challenge our intuitions or our assumptions, I would say, one of the really interesting things or findings from this report that to be honest, hasn't received quite as much focus or attention, but I think is just remarkably important, actually pertains to the way that renewable energy projects are cited, permitted, and approved. And right now in the United States, we have this, a lot of discussion and negotiation and policy debate happening over, what we broadly are calling permitting reform. And so, I think there's a big movement, I would say, from the renewable and clean power industry to streamline siting and permitting. And I can totally understand why, right? Like, again, we've talked about how challenging the world is for you all as developers, and how challenging opposition can be. So to sort of aim for streamlining, makes a lot of sense from that perspective. But some of the questions we asked in our survey, for example, said, okay, if we were to compare state level permitting versus local permitting, what do developers consider to be more efficient, more expensive, more certain? But then the last one that was really interesting was which one would provide greater net benefits to the host community. And so I think this provided some challenging but important insights to developers and community members and policymakers to think like, okay, developers clearly are saying state level permitting is more efficient, it's more certain, and they're more likely to get their projects built under, if we're talking about large utility scale renewable projects, more likely to get approved under a state siting and permitting authority. And that sort of goes in line with our assumptions. But then when we asked about which one would provide greater net benefits to the community, developers also seem to acknowledge that indeed the local based, siting and permitting authority could provide more of those benefits. So I think this is one of those areas where it's important to draw those data out and think about the implications of that and how that might inform the way that we think about permitting reform and streamlining. And benefits to the community. Like, okay, if we really want to move to state-based siting and permitting, let's make sure that we're not doing that at the expense of net benefits to hosting communities. So how do we kind of get the best of both worlds in that sense? So I would say that was an example of something that, sort of challenged assumptions and makes us think a little bit more deeply.
And how do you get the balance between what would be the right construct on a state level, right? But that would also keep moving. There's already so many headwinds for deployment of these projects. And so how do you make that not be another brake on the pedal, right? Another place
absolutely.
where things are getting slowed down to the point where it's not happening.
Yes. Yeah, that is such an important question. And I think, from the start, look, I'm not a developer, so I'm not sitting in your shoes. And so I think, to some degree, it's easy for me to sit in my ivory tower and say, oh, well, just do this or that. But what we have read from prior research is that, again, there is evidence that projects can be developed more quickly and at lower cost if the needs of the community are really taken into account and there's a genuine and participatory process to engage the host communities. So how do we do that without adding additional burden and cost and time delays to developers? I mean, I think, again, let me just give a little more context. We really recognize this industry has narrow profit margins. But on the other hand, another interesting tidbit or finding from this research was that a typical project that we heard about from this research is spending less than 0.1%, not 1%, 0.1% of a typical project capital expense on these community engagement expenditures. So it currently seems like it's a pretty small budget line item. And I get that every 0.1% really starts to add up when you got a tight margin. But at the same time, we also have been surveying large-scale solar project neighbors in just last year. And we learned that the vast majority of those, very nearby neighbors to large solar plants were totally unaware of those projects prior to the construction of the project. So in other words, those community engagement efforts prior to construction are not reaching the community members that actually live close. The majority of them were totally unaware until project was, either started or completed. So we do think there's room for improvement, right? You could maybe spend a little more than 0.1% of CapEx. And it's really vital that community members are aware. I mean, that's a tenet of procedural justice, that the host community members actually know, what's coming and have some information about it. So how do we do that in a way that's balanced? I mentioned earlier this sort of typical development process that has been, maybe pejoratively described as decide, announce, defend, and that sounds quite negative. And I know a lot of developers are moving in other directions or have moved away from that. But I think the idealized version might sound more like consult with the community, consider their feedback, modify your project, and then proceed. So consult, consider, modify, proceed, instead of decide, announce, defend. So how do we move to more genuine, participatory, meaningful engagement to get to that other paradigm? The other thing I would say that helps us kind of strike a balance is not necessarily the responsibility of developers. And what I'm talking about here is really like proactive, community-based planning and visioning of what renewable energy in our community could look like or should look like, what we want, what we envision, how renewable energy can benefit, can fit in with my identity of my community. And those
You think you like it from an economic development sort of a proactive economic and community benefit basis.
Absolutely. And the key, I love that you reiterated that it's proactive, because I think a lot of times what we're seeing and where we're seeing opposition really emerge is what I would describe as reactive. So you have a project come in doing the decide, announce, defend model, perhaps, and then you have a reactive response that's a fear-based response, and opposition forms, and you have delays and cancellations. What if we were to flip that on its head and have communities, again, not even with the developer around, but have what we're thinking about as very neutral, third party kind of intermediary or a trusted expert to lead and facilitate these conversations really before a project comes to the town. And we've seen in some of the pilots that we've been doing, experimenting with this idea, just real success with that model where, and especially if it's done in a really intentional way where you're bringing in the right stakeholders. It's not just an open mic where anybody can come up and dominate and talk. I mean, you as developers, you guys have all seen that go wrong. So we are working on a project now where we've set up a real well-defined and intentional process where we actually leverage university extension offices to lead and facilitate these meetings. Now, university extension, for those who aren't familiar, typically have been used for agriculture, and they're really just trusted kind of neutral scientific experts that are part of the university, but are really well trusted in rural communities as well. And they don't have a stake in the development of renewable energy, but they can facilitate these sort of meetings to allow that proactive planning to occur. So I think kind of between thinking about how to achieve better outcomes, like I said, between developers trying to move towards a more genuine consult, consider, modify, proceed process, and at the same time, having more and more communities proactively planning and thinking instead of being reactive. I do believe we can get there.
Mm. And I do think that there's a lot of developers that are, and Origis included, that are doing a lot to take those concerns into consideration, create the pivots that you outline in the study, right?
Yes.
To modify and then be able to move forward with something that is more collaborative, right? But and I also think that there's a growing awareness in the industry around the types of opposition. So
Right.
the sort of true community opposition versus AstroTurf sort of opposition. Could you talk to us a little bit about what your study revealed around how developers are seeing those kinds of oppositions?
Yeah, I think we didn't ask too much about that, but we did ask a couple questions of developers to say, to what extent do you think, opposition is a vocal minority versus,
Ah,
really representing the true population of these communities and things like that. And it is very clear, from those results that, yeah, developers tend to think that, opposition is often a vocal minority, and as well that it can be funded and supported by non-local interests, which I think is quite reasonable. In some cases is true, but I think we don't want to just sort of assume that all opposition
yeah.
is astroturf or is non-local and is supported by other interests. It's just becomes very hard to disentangle where someone's legitimate concern becomes a blurry line into misinformation and disinformation and astroturf and external interests kind of influencing the process. So I think this is really hard to disentangle, and our study isn't really maybe designed to untangle those. But at the
Mm,
same time, I think we do what we're trying to do is establish ways for, that to exist, but
mhm.
for if it is a minority, for, those the majority of voices to still come out and be represented. And I think that proactive planning is one example where you can do that, where maybe I should bring in an anecdote from some of our prior research, which was that when we analyzed wind energy project neighbors, this was few years back, we did a survey of about 1,700 residents who live very close to utility scale wind energy projects. And one of the things we learned is that, across this nationally representative sample of people living very close to wind projects, overall attitudes about the wind project were positive, largely positive, or they didn't care. But, we had a very small fraction of them that had a negative attitude about their project. But where it got really interesting is when we asked, did you participate in public meetings before the project was built? Did you come to the town hall meeting? And then we further asked, did you speak out at the meeting? And what we found amongst the people who spoke out at the meeting is it was more like a 50-50 split between those who were opposed and those who were supportive. So what that tells us is that those town hall meetings are not necessarily representative of the true population, since we know, okay, the true population of these neighbors is largely, has a positive attitude about them. But those who come and speak out at the meeting, if you're more worried and concerned and you're opposed to the project, you're just more likely to come and talk about it. So bringing all of this back to your question, I think one of the things that we're trying to do through this research and other projects we have going on at Berkeley Lab is really, support that kind of more representative and democratic process and fair information, sharing, so that it's not just this minority voice that can dominate the conversation.
Well, and I think that juxtaposition between we could have these constructs, these proactive constructs in communities where communities are saying, leaders are saying from an economic development point of view, because there's so much good that renewable energy can bring to a community. That juxtaposition between the construct or the process to build those plans and what's happening and how developers can work within those, I think would be a really interesting conversation to follow up with, Joe.
Yeah. Yes, let's do it.
So, I mean, this is a topic that we've just scratched the surface here today on this topic. And listeners, we will have links to the Halfway Up the Ladder study and the presentation that Joe and any of the other ones that we can figure out to list there on the blog post, so that you can access those. Joe, in summary, because we could talk for a long time, I think, about this topic, what would be the 3 takeaways from the developer's point of view that you would want the audience to know?
Yeah. I'm glad you gave me the opportunity to distill down 3 key points, because I've shared a lot of different ideas and have yammered on quite a bit. So let me think about 3 key things that I want people to remember. Number 1, from this survey, we really learned that community opposition is not just kind of a fringe or minor concern anymore when we're talking about building renewable energy projects. What we saw very clearly is that community opposition and local ordinances and zoning that very much relate to that opposition are just right up there at the top alongside grid interconnection in terms of being, the top 3 leading barriers to deploying renewable energy projects and getting them built and online. So, major issue for the industry to figure out how to, design and develop projects that are in partnership with communities and acceptable to communities. Okay, number 2, let's put this in the bigger picture. And again, as someone who's not just trying to develop my project or work for a developer, I'm kind of looking across the whole spectrum of all development happening in the country, and I'm relating that to the decarbonization targets and goals that we have, and whether that's at the federal scale with Biden's goal to have a zero carbon electric sector by 2035, or state level goals, or even utility level goals. In order to meet those targets, we simply have to deploy renewable energy at a much faster pace than we are right now. And in order to do that, here's my second takeaway: we need communities to be true partners and advocates for these projects. So that requires meaningful community engagement. It's just critical if we're going to meet these goals. And so I want to just put that in context, that if we're going to reach those targets, we need to do it with communities. They're not the enemy. They need to be our partners. Number 3, let's go back to this idea of tight profit margins. And we know it's a tough market, and there are realities of this market. As well, I should acknowledge that developers, maybe don't have empirical evidence that proactive engagement and really meaningful public engagement is going to, benefit their bottom line. Yet, we do see room for improvement. And I alluded to this earlier, but, we talked about the very relatively low fraction of development expenses that are spent on community engagement. We talked about how most community members are not even aware that the project is coming until after it's built. We generally think that a little bit more spending on community engagement and really meaningful participatory processes with the public could be a worthwhile investment with a solid return. Now, I'm not giving you evidence that you can bring to the bank here. This is sort of based on all this survey work that we've done over the years. But we generally think there's evidence to support that, this could reduce developers' sunk costs in terms of project cancellation and delays by spending a little bit more upfront in community engagement. And it was clear from this survey that the majority of developers said very clearly that they save more money through community engagement than they spend. So that's the third takeaway is, we do think this community engagement, public participation, we recognize that it costs money and time, and it's a tight market, but we feel there's evidence to support that is an investment with a good return.
Well, and I think it's heartening to look at in the last 3 years that this level of opposition has really ramped up in all of its many forms. Also, the industry is really paying attention, really working at the conferences, really, like you said, you've got a number of studies, and now this one from the developer's point of view. There's a lot that the industry is working on, quote, together,
Mhm.
which I think is a good sign that we're trying to understand how to move this forward with all the stakeholders at the table as much as possible, right?
Agreed.
Do you
Yes.
think I've said that well?
Absolutely. Yeah,
Okay.
it needs to be a team effort, and it's a competitive world out there, but this is one of those things we got to work together on for sure.
Well, excellent. Well, Joe, thank you so much for being on Power Players for this important opening salvo, I think, on this topic. And you are and have been a solar power player.
Thank you.
Find more information on this topic and more insights on clean energy at origisenergy.com.